Hello, my loves. Welcome to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. A slightly late episode today because I am recording this morning and it should have gone live about 4 hours ago. But it's coming today. Hey, we're on schedule. I'm not an organised queen, but here we are. There is an episode today. And today's episode is going to be a solo one where I'm talking all about Father's Day. And I know Father's Day was at the weekend, and part of me felt like this episode should have stood last week so that we could talk about it before it came about. But actually, I feel like this is going to be really impactful after Father's Day, because I think there are a lot of people who will be in different situations, who I've spoken to over the last few days, who have experienced the day completely differently. And I think all of that's really valid, and it's important to know that however the day looked for you, whether it was really sad, whether it was filled with anger, whether you attempted to reach out and were met with stonewalling because you have a narcissistic mother, or you have a father who just spat his dummy out because he wasn't getting his own way, a narcissistic father, then that day doesn't have any bearing on this week and where you're at right now. So let's have a chat about it. So, first thing I wanted to say in this episode is that if you have no contact with your father and you chose not to get in contact over Father's Day, that is okay. You did not, never will owe your dad a phone call just because it's Father's Day. Okay, and I think that's quite a difficult concept for a lot of people, especially if you're in a fresh estrangement and you've cut contact more recently, or even if you've cut contact, and I think this hits home for a lot of people, especially if you've cut contact with your mum and your dad has made the choice to almost side with her, as opposed to being like, look, you don't have to have contact with your mum. Yes, it makes things a bit awkward for me, but I'm still going to be here for you, and choose to step forward for you as their child, not enable that toxic parenting behaviour from mum, but they don't, and they choose to push you aside and say, well, look, it's too difficult for me. If you can't have contact with mum, you can't have contact with me. That scenario is crushing for so many people, and it's not an uncommon one. It's not an uncommon one at all to see people cut contact with one parent and say, look, they are abusive, this behaviour is unacceptable, I'm not going to tolerate it anymore, really set those boundaries in place, and find that the other parent follows. And it baffles my brain, because I look at my children and there's absolutely no way, and I think my own spouse would agree with me on this, that if they turned around and said, your behaviour has been unacceptable, I'm no longer going to have contact with you until I can see changed behaviour, or even perhaps then I don't want to, full stop, I'm just not having contact with you. There's just no way that either me or my spouse would then go, yeah, well, we're going to cut you off too because, you've upset my partner. It just wouldn't happen, because we value our children, and yes, we value each other, but they're different relationships. And this whole side-taking thing, where you find one parent chooses to continue their behaviour and the other one chooses to stick with them even though their behaviour has been unacceptable and it's obviously caused hurt enough that the adult child wants to cut contact. It's such a difficult scenario to be in around special days, when you feel like the parent that you cut off is pulling the strings and you've got dad there who is just the enabler. And I say just the enabler, but enabling in itself is an abuse. Enabling in itself is a huge part of what causes childhood trauma. So there's no just about being an enabler. But when you feel that your parent, dad in this scenario, because it's just been Father's Day, hasn't actually done anything wrong per se other than stand by and watch it, which is in itself an entire episode talking about enabling parents and making your peace with the reality of what that really means for you. And I'm going to write that down because that's definitely an episode. Okay, I've got that jotted down, otherwise that will go completely out of my head. But knowing that parent that's chosen to side, even though you never drew lines to say you've got to side with one or the other, but they did, and the narcissistic parent often does, draw that line and say, well, you can't have contact with them, or sends them as flying monkeys to try and make some peace there. If you chose not to contact your father on Father's Day because of your mother, you're not alone in that. I've spoken to so many people who have messaged and said, actually, I feel like I kind of had an okay relationship with my dad. He wasn't great. He enabled a lot of my mum's behaviour, but he was my good parent. You know, he was the one that I kind of looked to. And it's really hard now seeing that he wasn't a good parent, but he's chosen to cut me off because I've cut her off, and I don't know where I stand. Or I do know where I stand, but it's heartbreaking because I shouldn't be in that position. No parent should choose their spouse over their child when there was never even really a choice to make. It was just, I don't want a relationship with mum. And yeah, that makes things awkward, but why would you cut me off? It's a whole process that's really, really difficult. And what you have to remember is that person's behaviour is outside the realm of your control. And if you have a father who chooses to turn around and say, you know what, I'm not going to have contact with you because you've upset my wife, you're not alone in that, not by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually really quite common. And it's not okay. It's not okay at all. And it's really difficult to work through because you feel almost like, but I didn't have a problem with you. And now you've made a problem with me, and I feel like I can't contact you, even if perhaps you want to. And leaning into that wanting to, I've spoken to a number of people over the last week who would love to be able to get in contact with their father, would love to be able to reach out and have their dad jokes on Father's Day and spend some time together and be able to go for a meal and just have a bit of a nice day out, go and celebrate somebody, but they don't feel that they have that person. Or perhaps they did feel that they had that person, and then dad's remarried and they don't get on with the new partner. And that, again, the choice has been made, the line has been drawn of, if you can't accept my partner or you don't get on with this person, then I won't have contact with you. And I think it's important to note it's wholly different when you have an adult child whose parents don't get on with the partner, because the relationship responsibility is always there for the parent. And that's not to say that they can't express to you, I'm not keen on that person, but I'll stay out of it. That is not necessarily unhealthy to say, I've got reservations about this person, I'll stay out of it, it's your business, you're an adult. But if you have a parent who's taken on a new partner and they don't get on with the kids, that's a red flag to me. If it's a case of, well, if you can't accept my new partner, then I'm just going to have no contact with you. That's not how a parenting relationship works. You are always the parent. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that you can be an adult child and go in guns blazing of, you can't have this relationship, because you don't have a right, regardless of who you are, to control what another person's relationships look like. That is problematic behaviour. But if there is a lot of unacceptable behaviour from a new step parent, and you have your parents saying, well, I'm choosing them over you, that is a tale as old as time that I have in my coaching chair when somebody, especially when they're teenagers, and I'm telling you now, if you are a single parent or you are dating someone and your kid cannot stand them, you don't choose the new partner. You don't. You don't choose the new partner, you choose your child, because that's where your responsibility lies and where your obligation lies. And yes, you've absolutely got to have something for yourself, you've got to have a life for yourself, but that's where your communication comes in. And what I see so often with toxic parents, especially fathers, is this choice made for a new partner and a new life, and a discard of the old life, and with it the children. And that's so problematic, and I am not, again, saying that is an exclusively male role. It's not by any stretch of the imagination. I have so many people who I work with, who I've spoken to over the years, whose mothers have done exactly the same thing. I do see it very commonly, especially with adult children, of dads kind of like, well, I've raised you, so you do you, I'll do me, and if you two can't get on, then I'm just not going to bother with you anymore. And that's really, really, really hard to navigate. I think another angle of Father's Day that is really difficult to navigate, and it might be something that you've kind of come past now, but could be something that you're still experiencing, is when you have a narcissistic father or a toxic father who has chosen to not really bother with you. Very much my experience growing up, my dad was very much not interested. And in fairness, if he was interested and he did try to build a relationship with me, my mum made that extremely difficult. But I can say hand on heart, as much as my mum made that very difficult and there was a lot of alienation that went on, there was no effort from my dad. And that is a story that I hear again over and over. There's just no effort. And he chose his new partner over me. We didn't get on. We didn't like each other. I remember him saying to me on the phone once when I'd said, but do you love her more than me because I'm your daughter and I should be there? And I think those words had been very much encouraged from my mum, because that sounds to me now as an adult an odd question for a young teen to ask. But I obviously felt some way that I just was not important to this man who's meant to be my dad. And I remember asking it, and I remember hearing her in the background and him saying, yeah, I do, I love her more than you. And then ringing me in the car when he'd gone out to say, look, I didn't mean it, I love you more. And I just think it's just so spineless and so infuriating, but again, so bloody common. And what's really difficult surrounding that scenario is when your father moves on and has his own relationship, has his own family, and you feel almost stuck on the outside watching Father's Day happen with posts on Facebook, with posts on Insta and all of this nicey, I'm amazing. Or even if you have siblings who still have contact with your toxic father and you're like, hey, my experience with him was horrific, and you're there being like, best dad in the world, are you fucking kidding me? Best dad in the world, that man was abusive, he did this, he did that. And it feels so isolating. Firstly, watching this new family dynamic, or even with your other siblings, be that step siblings, half siblings, siblings, whatever it'll be, watching that happen whilst you're on the outside of it because you don't have contact is an extremely difficult part of these holidays to navigate, because you feel secure in your truth, but it shakes you to the core when no one else can see it. I spoke with someone online recently who was talking about her experience with her father, who was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive, and absolutely no other siblings were interested in challenging that. They'd even seen his physical abuse where he'd hit her, where he had thrown her across the room, all of these kinds of things. Everyone knew about it. It had been acknowledged at the time as, oh, well, you made him angry. And then nothing after that. And as adults now, they all continue to have a relationship with him, but he doesn't have any access to her. She's managed to completely block him. He doesn't know anything about her. And that was crippling for her, watching Father's Day play out, seeing her siblings, who she does still have contact with, and who there is a lot of resentment there that they don't step forward and acknowledge her experience, and that they continue to have a relationship like this person was a wonderful father when in fact he was horrendous. But this is what I keep saying, is that siblings experience people differently, and they experience their parents differently. We never have the same parents, and you can't dictate whether or not that person has a relationship with someone else. You just can't do it. What you can do is say, I don't want to know about that. I don't want to hear about that. But that still makes days like Father's Day, Christmas, weddings, funerals, all of these things really fucking difficult, because it becomes a case of either I'm going to be there or he or she is going to be there. And which one are you going to pick? And it almost does place the person in the middle. But what you have to do is say, are they going to be there? If they are, I'm not. And I'm not pretending or playing nice. I don't want to be there. Or if you do feel able to be there, you have to go and say, I'm going to be there, but I don't want to have contact with them. If they come to me, I will walk away. And set your firm boundaries, because again, they can't dictate whether or not you have a relationship with your parent. It's just not how these things work. You have to make your own decisions, but that doesn't mean that they're not really painful. I think there's something to be said for being that child, even as an adult, who is on the fringe, watching Father's Day happen, watching everyone play happy families, especially when you know for certain that it was anything but happy families. And it feels really icky, for lack of a better word, knowing that everyone's almost role-playing or wondering what's wrong with you that you can't let it go. And yes, the experience that I've just shared there was in an extreme case, but even down to narcissistic behaviours from a father who shouted a lot, or who centred himself a lot, who was always very grandiose, however that might be, that you've chosen to cut contact with. And you watched your siblings be shouted at, you watched your siblings be frightened of this person, you watched, and perhaps if you're one of the older children, or perhaps not, perhaps at any sibling age, you were the one who stepped forward and said, hey, back off. You tried to protect them in some way, and then you ended up getting the comeuppance for that. That's really difficult, watching them making happy families, or not feeling able to cut contact themselves, maybe not wanting to cut contact themselves, wanting to just quote unquote put it behind them, and yet you've chosen not to. That's a really challenging situation to be in. And I wish that I could give answers and say, you know, you do this and it'll fix it, do this and it'll make it easy for you. But there isn't really anything that you can do watching that situation. The only things that you can do are manage what you do and don't see. If that means removing family members who still have contact with that person, so be it. If that means no longer going on Facebook or Insta or whatever it is over that time period, so be it. It's really difficult trying to protect yourself, and it almost feels like you're always on the back foot, always trying to not get hurt, even though you've made the ultimate decision to not have contact. There's still those little lingering bits that just dig a knife in, really. Another common thing that's come up whilst we're on the topic of siblings around Father's Day is siblings getting in touch saying, why haven't you got in touch with Dad? Why haven't you reached out to him? Or, my dad's so upset because you've done this. And that's again really difficult to navigate, and all you can do in those scenarios is set your boundaries and say, this is nothing to do with you. But that doesn't make it any easier, and it doesn't make it feel like it stings any less when you have these people coming in as flying monkeys and coming to tell you how awful you are, or reaching out to say you've done something wrong, or asking, pleading, will you please get in touch with Dad? It's so unfair that you don't, and completely invalidating how you feel, especially when it's a sibling or another parent, because they watched what you went through and they refused to acknowledge it. And those kind of feelings are so much more present around days like Father's Day, Mother's Day, Christmas, weddings, all of that kind of thing, I feel, because that's when everybody thinks we should get together, or everybody feels that we should make this effort with each other. And on a day like Father's Day, it's really challenging to navigate that. But you have not done anything wrong. And as I said at the beginning, you don't owe your dad a contact or a Father's Day call, any of those things, just because it's Father's Day. If they were a shitty dad and you've chosen to cut contact, then that's okay to not acknowledge these days. If they were an abusive parent and you've chosen to step away from them, just because someone tells you that June the whatever is a day for fathers, doesn't mean that you have to acknowledge it, or that you have to do anything different to what you were already doing. Coming away from that slightly and moving on to another angle, someone had left a comment on a post that I posted on my Instagram community, unfollowing_mum. And if you're not a part of that community, I would love for you to come over and join. It is a place where we share resources, and I think there's so much power in community healing. And I say it over and over again that this is why I set up the podcast, but it is because hearing other people's experiences and knowing that I wasn't alone really helped me. and is still helpful to me because I have a lot that I feel is unprocessed around my dad in particular. But somebody left a comment on one of my posts about Father's Day that said, I wish I read this at 10 a.m. before I sent him a message and never got a reply back. I don't know why I even bothered. I try to be forgiving, but ultimately it leaves me hurt and disappointed every single time. And I felt like that particular comment really struck home, that sometimes we see these days as an opportunity to reach out. And we see these days as an opportunity to almost test the water and see whether or not things have changed. Maybe my parent's going to be accountable now. Maybe my dad has reflected on the fact that we've not had contact for such a long time and that he's been a really shitty dad. And maybe, just maybe, that toxic hope sitting there on your shoulders telling you that maybe things are going to be different. And then you get nothing back. Or you get back something snide or snarky, or you get a phone call from a sibling or from their partner or your mum or whoever it might be that says, why are you bothering? And it's really difficult to navigate that space where you've reached out, you've made yourself vulnerable. And I think there's a lot of anger that comes with that as well, because even saying that, then what came up for me then was you've made yourself vulnerable. And the feeling of, if I were to make myself vulnerable, and I often do this in a lot of my relationships, even now, where I don't like to be vulnerable, so I'm not going to open up to you. If you've hurt me or you've upset me or something has gone wrong, then I'm going to clam up about that. If I've tried to communicate about it and it's not gone well, then no thank you very much, because that's just going to hurt me, and that's not necessarily healthy. But it is something that comes with the experience of continually being smacked down when you've made yourself vulnerable. And no response is a response. That no response from him to this person who commented, and it was a public comment, so it's okay to read it out, that was a response. It was a dismissal. It was, you're not important enough to me to even bother to reply. And perhaps they got a reply another day. But in that moment, especially when they've not had contact, it was necessary to just send a quick reply. Just say thank you or love you, anything, just to let you know that they're there. And the thing with narcissistic parents, and this is for both sides of the coin, there is that element of power in having someone come to you and extend an olive branch. And when you are grandiose and you have those feelings of superiority and you have been hurt by someone, and when I say hurt by someone, I mean they've taken away your control, they've taken away your power, or they've called you out on your bullshit, and you've got that narcissistic injury where there is no reflection, no accountability, no introspection, looking at yourself and thinking, oh, well, what was my part in that? Maybe I need to hold my hands up here and say I've done this wrong, validate some feelings. None of that. It's just you've called me out, or you've challenged me, or you've cut contact with me, and I am injured. That's what a narcissistic injury is like. There's just no thought put into how have we got here. It's you've done this, you are bad, there we go, job done, I'm hurt. There's that expectation to almost grovel, and when you extend that olive branch, it gives them that level of power, it gives them that level of control, because now you've extended it and you clearly are vulnerable at this moment, hoping that they will come back to you, or hoping that you will be able to have some kind of repair, even if it's just I've really missed you, thank you for this, I've really missed you, I hope you're doing okay, anything. And it doesn't come, and it's just another way in which to hurt. And this is the problem with these kinds of relationships, is it's never about how can we reform the relationship, how can things get better. It's about, where does my power lie? And if you're vulnerable and you are in need, well then there's my power. I think as well it would be remiss not to talk about when you have experienced a very toxic mother and I'm loath to use the word alienation because, yes, alienation is a thing. However, it's often used to dismiss and diminish people who have chosen to become estranged, especially when they are young adults and teenagers who've chosen to not have contact with a toxic parent anymore. And that really bugs me. And I want to make a differential between alienation, where you have someone who is effectively making it impossible for you to have a relationship with the other parent, who is constantly bad-mouthing them, constantly encouraging you, making it feel, whether it is or not, unsafe to have a relationship with that person, especially emotionally unsafe is a very common one, versus estrangement, where you make the choice. You choose to not have contact with that person based on your own thoughts and feelings. Alienation is coercive abuse, and it does exist, but unfortunately it is way overused to excuse being a poor parent, to excuse not being accountable for your own actions, and especially in things like younger children who are not wanting to leave single mums. It's often, you've alienated them from me, and no. But I do think that with the type of podcast that this is, it would be remiss not to talk about the experience of growing up with an extremely toxic mother who you didn't think of as a toxic mother, my experience, and navigating what it feels like to have a father who you now don't have a relationship with, who is perhaps deceased, who you've cut contact with, and you recognise their own flaws, but you have now come to the point where you recognise how much of your thoughts and feelings towards your father were amplified, perhaps, or maybe amplified is the wrong word, manipulated by your mother. And this could be either way, could be a reverse where you've had a toxic father, but because we're talking about Father's Day, and I think those feelings come up a lot. For me in particular, I look back at my relationship with my dad and I wonder how different it would have been if my mother hadn't have behaved the way that she did. And she used to be very keen to say, I never make it difficult for you to see your dad. I even drive you all the way through to Sheffield to go and see him, and I do this and I do that. And he pretends that I make it hard. And that in and of itself wasn't necessarily healthy, because I was sat there thinking, yes, Mum does all of this, my dad just doesn't want me. And sadly, there was an element of truth to that in my story. But for some people, that's not necessarily the case. And what you've got is a parent who could no longer stay in a relationship with a toxic, abusive person, but was not able to take their kids with them. And often mums were believed when they said, he's the problem, he's doing this, he's doing that. And often they were right, but in some cases they were not. And what you've got is a child stuck in the middle who wants to please their primary caregiver, which, let's face it, was often mum when we look back at, say, the 80s, 90s, noughties. Even now is often mum because of the way that our society is constructed. And dad who left, and that in and of itself becomes a big problem. I know I harbour a lot of resentment towards my dad for leaving, especially when he left having an affair and essentially chose a new life over being with me. And there's a lot of me that still feels that wound very deeply. But I do wonder, how different would my life be if my dad was still alive? And there is a grief around that, in order for me to have a conversation with him and say, hey, I see my mum for what she is, but you've got to be accountable for some of the shit you did. You've got to be aware of how piss poor your behaviour was and how much you left me to fend for myself. And would he ever be accountable for that? Would he be able to sit down and acknowledge that? Or was he as narcissistic as my mum painted him, and as narcissistic as he appeared? And I think there's an element as well, when a toxic parent dies, for some people, of looking back with rose-tinted glasses and thinking, was it that bad? And for some people, there will be no rose-tinted glasses. There will be, thank fuck that person's gone. They were absolutely 150,000% that bad. In fact, I'm being generous, they were worse. And for other people, there will be that element of, would they ever have been accountable? Would they ever have changed their behaviour? I it's pointless to ponder on it, but I do sometimes wonder, would I have been able to have a relationship with my dad now that I no longer have a relationship with my mum? Would I have actually allowed myself to do that as a person who was so enmeshed with my mum, who felt such an intense loyalty to her? Would I be able to have a relationship with him, or would I hold myself back from that, even if he was able to be accountable, because it still felt like a betrayal? And I think I probably just answered my own question there. But he is not here for me to consider. And I think, again, there is that element of looking back with rose-tinted glasses and hoping that at least one of my parents wouldn't have been quite as shit as they were. But actually, I don't think he ever would have been accountable. I think he would have continued to push it onto my mum. And I do know there are people out there who have that experience where they can reconnect with the parent who was perhaps alienated, and that parent didn't get an opportunity to be accountable for their mistakes, didn't get the opportunity to build any repair with their child because of the other parent. That does happen. It's a lot rarer than people make out, but it definitely does happen. But in my instance, I think it would have been a case of putting myself forward and being vulnerable, and almost an element of, I told you so. I told you she was the bad guy, when actually that's not healthy either. And if you have a parent who does feel like they can lord that over you, then that's not a healthy parent either. Okay, I think I have covered most bases for Father's Day. One more. If you felt absolutely nothing at all, totally forgot the day existed, and you have just made complete peace with not having contact with your father, in fact, you're not even bothered at all, saw other people celebrating their father and were like, smash, and you just didn't care, even slightly, that's also okay. That doesn't make you cold-hearted. It doesn't make you a bad child, well, adult child. It doesn't make you anything. It just means that that's how you've coped and how you've navigated things, and you've got to a point where that's what it is. And that's okay. However you felt about it, whether it came with grief, whether it came with anger, whether it came with resentment of your siblings because they were enjoying the day after everything that you all went through, whether it came with absolute apathy towards it and nothing at all, that's okay. And it's also okay if you found the day really difficult, even though you have a spouse who you wanted to celebrate, but you felt like there was something blocking you from that. And you felt like there was almost an element of, I don't want to make it all about me. I don't want to make it all about me, but also I'm really struggling and I want you to make me feel better, even though it's your day. That's okay too. It's how you navigate it and expressing those emotions to someone that you can trust and that you can have help you through the experiences, especially if you're in an early estrangement and you were really feeling low, is absolutely okay. Two things can be true at one time. You can have a spouse who you are really proud of and want to celebrate on Father's Day, and a father who you are so disappointed in and really hurt by. You can also have a father who you're so disappointed in and a spouse that you married that you deeply regret marrying because you're also really bloody disappointed in him and feel like there was a cycle, pattern, repeat there. That's okay. If you're aware of it now, you've been able to make changes and you can move forward. You cannot blame yourself, okay? I will speak to you again soon, guys. And, well, I'll speak to you again next week. Take care. And don't forget, you can always join my community over on Instagram, which is at unfollowing_mum. And I'm also at Toby and Rue. And you can come and find me over there. Speak to you soon, guys. Bye.